Africa has witnessed extraordinary leadership, but it has also endured leaders who left behind legacies soaked in corruption, bloodshed, and criminal activity. From war crimes and genocide to drug money and grand corruption, some African presidents have committed acts so grave they shook the conscience of their nations. In this video, we count down the 10 African presidents with the worst criminal backgrounds. Some have been convicted, others never tried, but their dark reputations speak volumes. Let the countdown begin. At number 10, Francois Bozize, Central African Republic. Francois Bozize came to power in 2003 through a military coup, toppling the government of Ange Félix Patasse and declaring himself president of the Central African Republic. For many citizens weary of instability, his arrival was a hopeful reset. But what followed was a regime marked by repression, corruption, and violence. Bozize's time in office was characterized by the centralization of power around his family and loyalists. Political opponents were silenced through intimidation, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. His elite presidential guard, notorious for its brutality, operated like a private army. Human rights organizations documented a pattern of state-sanctioned violence, particularly against civilians during internal conflicts. The most damning chapter came after he was overthrown in 2013. In May 2024, the Special Criminal Court of the Central African Republic issued an international arrest warrant for Bozize. He was charged with crimes against humanity, including torture, summary executions, and enforced disappearances committed while in power. Many of these crimes were tied to his attempt to cling to power during his final years in office. Today, Bozize lives in exile, but the international community continues to pressure for his extradition. His case remains a painful example of how authoritarian leadership can plunge an already fragile nation into deeper chaos. At number 9, Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz, Mauritania. Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz rose to power in 2008 after leading a coup, promising to restore order and fight corruption. But during his presidency, he became the very symbol of the corruption he vowed to eliminate. Aziz used his position to enrich himself, diverting public funds through shell companies and insider contracts. Investigators later uncovered luxury properties, large offshore bank accounts, and massive unexplained wealth tied to his inner circle. His government became a web of secrecy, patronage, and misuse of power. In 2020, shortly after leaving office, Aziz was indicted for corruption, money laundering, and abuse of office. The evidence was overwhelming. In May 2025, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, making him one of the few African presidents to be jailed for crimes committed while in office. His fall from grace shocked Mauritania and marked a rare moment of judicial accountability. For many, it also served as a cautionary tale. Even the most powerful can eventually be brought to justice. At number 8, Jacob Zuma, South Africa. Jacob Zuma's rise from rural poverty to the presidency was once celebrated as a triumph of resilience. But his time in office, 2009 to 2018, became one of the darkest chapters in South Africa's democratic journey. Zuma was the face of state capture, a term used to describe how private interests, particularly the Gupta family, hijacked control of government institutions. Billions were siphoned from state-owned enterprises like Eskom and Transnet. Cabinet ministers were hand-picked to serve the interests of these elites, while public trust in government crumbled. Zuma's legal troubles span over 700 charges of fraud, racketeering, and corruption, mostly tied to a massive 1999 arms deal worth $2 billion. In 2021, he was sentenced to prison for contempt of court, becoming the first democratic South African president to serve jail time. His legacy is one of betrayal, where promises of transformation gave way to deep institutional rot. Though still active in politics, Zuma remains a symbol of how power can be abused even in robust democracies. At number 7, Mobutu Sese Seko, Zaire, now DR Congo. Mobutu Sese Seko ruled Zaire for over 3 decades, from 1965 to 1997, turning the mineral-rich nation into his personal empire. With support from Western powers during the Cold War, Mobutu built a dictatorship based on fear, propaganda, and corruption. He is widely regarded as one of the most notorious kleptocrats in history. It's estimated that Mobutu stole between $4 and $5 billion from the state, even as his people suffered in extreme poverty. He constructed lavish palaces, owned luxury estates across Europe, and traveled in private jets. all while civil servants went unpaid and hospitals ran out of medicine. Mobutu's regime was also brutally repressive. Political opponents were tortured, exiled, or killed. Elections were rigged, and the press was tightly controlled. His cult of personality was so extreme, he renamed the country and even mandated the use of traditional attire and names. When his regime finally collapsed in 1997, it left behind a broken economy and a traumatized population. Mobutu fled into exile and died in Morocco, never facing trial for his crimes. At number 6, Mengistu Haile Mariam, Ethiopia. Mengistu Haile Mariam ruled Ethiopia from 1977 to 1991 and presided over one of the bloodiest regimes in modern African history. A Marxist military officer, he led the country during the infamous Red Terror, a campaign of mass political repression, torture, and execution. Tens of thousands of people, students, activists, and suspected opponents were systematically hunted down, imprisoned, and killed. Victims' bodies were often left in the streets as warnings. Families were billed for the bullets used in executions. Mengistu ruled through fear, turning Ethiopia into a surveillance state where dissent meant death. In 2006, long after fleeing to Zimbabwe, Mengistu was convicted in absentia of genocide by an Ethiopian court. Despite this conviction, he continues to live in exile under protection, having avoided extradition for decades. His reign also oversaw devastating famine and economic collapse, with millions dying from both violence and state negligence. To this day, Mengistu is remembered as a man who turned ideology into brutality and left an indelible scar on Ethiopia's history. At number 5, Jean-Bedel Bokassa, Central African Empire. Jean-Bedel Bokassa took authoritarian rule to an almost surreal level. After seizing power in 1966, he declared himself Emperor of the Central African Empire in 1976 and staged a coronation that cost the nation nearly $20 million, 1/3 of its entire budget. But behind the absurd theatrics was a reign of terror. Bokassa was accused of murder, torture, and even cannibalism. The most horrifying incident occurred in 1979 when he ordered the massacre of over 100 school children protesting school uniform mandates. Witnesses claimed he personally participated in the beatings and killings. Following his ousting later that year, Bokassa faced a series of trials. In 1987, he was convicted of murder and embezzlement, though charges of cannibalism were never proven in court. He was initially sentenced to death, but the sentence was later commuted. Bokassa's rule left a nation deeply scarred, economically ruined, politically unstable, and socially traumatized. His legacy remains one of the most grotesque examples of dictatorship gone mad. At number 4, Omar al-Bashir, Sudan. Omar al-Bashir ruled Sudan with an iron fist from 1989 to 2019, and his presidency is marked by one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern African history, the Darfur genocide. Under Bashir's command, government-backed militias known as the Janjaweed carried out brutal campaigns of ethnic cleansing. Over 300,000 people were killed, millions displaced, and countless others raped and tortured. Entire villages were burned to the ground, all in the name of crushing rebellion. In 2009 and 2010, Bashir became the first sitting president to be indicted by the International Criminal Court, ICC, for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Despite global outrage, he refused to step down, traveling freely for years while evading arrest. It wasn't until Sudan's 2019 revolution that Bashir was finally removed from power. He was later convicted domestically for corruption, and he currently remains in Sudanese custody, awaiting possible extradition to the ICC. Omar al-Bashir's name is now synonymous with impunity, and his legacy remains a haunting reminder of how long the world can take to respond to mass atrocities. At number 3, Hissene Habre, Chad. Hissene Habre ruled Chad from 1982 to 1990 and turned the country into a police state built on fear, repression, and systemic violence. His brutal regime left an estimated 40,000 people dead, according to human rights groups. Habre's secret police, the Documentation and Security Directorate, DDS, carried out mass torture, political assassinations, and disappearances. Victims were electrocuted, burned, or suffocated. Entire ethnic groups, particularly the Sara and Hajarai, were targeted for extermination during purges. For years, Habre evaded justice while living comfortably in exile in Senegal. But in a historic moment for African justice, he was arrested, tried, and convicted in 2016 by a special tribunal established by the African Union. The court found him guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and rape, sentencing him to life in prison. This conviction marked the first time an African leader was prosecuted and sentenced on African soil for human rights abuses. Habre died in 2021 while serving his sentence, but his trial set a precedent for holding tyrants accountable, even decades after their crimes. At number 2, Idi Amin, Uganda. Idi Amin, who ruled Uganda from 1971 to 1979, is remembered as one of Africa's most terrifying dictators. Known for his erratic behavior and brutal methods, Amin's regime is estimated to have killed between 100,000 and 500,000 people. He began his rule with mass purges of soldiers and political opponents. Torture chambers operated in military barracks. Entire families vanished overnight. Amin's paranoia led him to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat, including judges, journalists, and even cabinet members. In 1972, he expelled over 80,000 Asians, many of whom were key to Uganda's economy. Their departure caused economic collapse, and the nation plunged into chaos. Amin also allegedly engaged in cannibalism. Though never proven, the rumors added to his image of madness. He declared himself conqueror of the British Empire and ruled with absolute power, often making bizarre, violent decisions without warning. In 1979, he was overthrown and fled to Saudi Arabia, where he lived in luxury until his death in 2003, never facing justice for the horrors he inflicted. Amin's rule left Uganda traumatized and remains a symbol of unchecked, tyrannical violence. Finally, at number 1, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, Nigeria. At the top of this list is Bola Ahmed Tinubu, Nigeria's current president. Though not convicted in a criminal court, his past is surrounded by deep and persistent criminal allegations, spanning decades, countries, and political offices. In 1993, U.S. authorities seized $460,000 from Tinubu's U.S. bank account, alleging it was linked to heroin trafficking proceeds in Chicago. The case ended in civil forfeiture, not a criminal conviction, but the documents remained damning. Tinubu never contested the drug connection under oath. Back home, as former governor of Lagos State, he was repeatedly accused of money laundering, tax fraud, and corruption through shell companies. Critics claim he turned Lagos into a private empire, controlling revenue through proxies and using political influence to shield his financial empire. In 2023, controversies around his academic records and age inconsistencies further fueled public distrust. Despite the baggage, Tinubu rose to become Nigeria's most powerful politician elected president in 2023. To his opponents, Tinubu represents everything wrong with Nigeria's political elite: unaccountable, untouchable, and surrounded by silence. While courts have yet to convict him, the shadows around his name refuse to disappear.